The story began not with whispers, but with thunder. David said, "They're tearing me apart online." His phone buzzed endlessly, screens flashing hashtags that cursed his name, each headline sharper than the last. Emma said, "You need to breathe." But David's chest burned as if the walls were closing in. Every post was a nail in the coffin of the empire he once built with Mark, his trusted partner. In seconds, admiration had turned into outrage. David remembered their shared victories, the long nights building dreams, and now betrayal tasted like ash in his mouth. Mark said, "I had no choice." His words replayed like a cruel echo. Online, faceless mobs howled, their joy woven into David's downfall. Emma tried to hold him, but his trembling hands pushed her away. David said, "It was him, wasn't it? Mark sold me out." The betrayal was no rumor. It was carved into every article. Friends turned shadows, silence filled his messages, and trust shattered into dust. He stared at his reflection, eyes hollow, mouth dry, the face of a man already buried alive. The storm had arrived without mercy, and his world was already in flames. The noise outside became unbearable. Reporters crowded the street, cameras flashing like lightning. David whispered, "They've turned my house into a circus." Emma closed the curtains, heart pounding. Mark's betrayal was no longer hidden. It lived on every news channel. Neighbors avoided eye contact, whispers followed every step. David said, "Do they see me as a monster now?" His empire once symbolized trust, now it reeked of scandal. Emma said, "We have to fight back." But the fight felt impossible when the enemy had once shared his table. David remembered the laughter they shared over signed contracts and victories. Now that laughter echoed as mockery. His daughter's toys lay scattered near the doorway, innocent yet fragile against the storm. The weight of betrayal pressed harder with each headline, crushing what was left of his pride. The living room felt like a cage. Emma paced, phone in hand, searching for truth in the noise. David sat motionless, haunted. He said, "Mark knew every secret. Every partnership document, every handshake deal, all vulnerable." Emma said, "You trusted him more than anyone." Silence thickened. The television replayed the betrayal. Headlines, analysis, and commentators dissecting David's fall. Each word pierced deeper. He saw footage of Mark smiling at a conference, confident, untouchable. David said, "He looks proud." His voice broke. The betrayal wasn't just survival, it was ambition dressed as loyal. The doorbell rang, sharp and unkind. David froze. Outside, reporters shouted questions, voices colliding in chaos. Emma whispered, "Don't open it." But silence was no shield. The world outside demanded his ruin. David said, "Every truth is twisted now." His daughter cried in the background, fear soaking into her sobs. Emma rushed to hold her, while David's fists clenched tight. Memories of friendship with Mark replayed, mocking him with each knock. The betrayal had turned home into prison. He said, "I can't hide forever." Yet stepping out meant feeding the fire that burned his name. The night grew heavier. David sat by the window, watching rain smear neon lights across the glass. Emma said, "Tomorrow, it gets worse." He nodded slowly. The storm etched deep into his face. Mark's name appeared again on the news ticker, now hailed as a whistleblower. David whispered, "He's painting himself the hero." The truth twisted cruelly. Mark rose as David fell. Emma touched his arm, her voice trembling. "You can still tell your story." David's silence carried more weight than words. Outside, the mob roared louder, while inside, the world quietly broke apart. Morning crept in, without mercy. David sat at the kitchen table, head heavy, eyes swollen from a night of restless silence. Emma poured coffee, her hands shaking. David said, "Do you remember when people cheered for me?" The smell of coffee filled the air but carried no warmth. Emma whispered, "You weren't just admired, David, you were respected." His gaze fell on family photos lined on the wall. reminders of life before chaos. In those frames, smiles were effortless, victories sweet and trust unbroken. Now every photo mocked the fragile man staring back. David muttered, "I was building more than wealth, I was building legacy." Emma's silence spoke louder than comfort. The betrayal of Mark stung fresh with every memory. David's daughter padded softly into the kitchen, clutching her toy. She asked, "Daddy, why are people outside so angry?" David's heart cracked at her innocence. He said, "Because sometimes people believe lies faster than truth." The room grew heavier, not from noise, but from the ache of who David once was, and the shattered fragments he now carried. David stared at his laptop, screen filled with old photos from conferences and events. There he was, standing tall beside Mark, smiles bright beneath banners of success. David whispered, "We were unstoppable once." Emma leaned over, scrolling through headlines mocking his downfall. She said, "They erased all that in a single night." The contrast was cruel, the weight unbearable. David slammed the laptop shut, his voice cracking. He used my trust to save himself. The house felt smaller with every heartbeat, the walls pushing him toward despair. Emma said, "People will forget the headlines, David, but you can't forget who you are." His chest tightened, memories pulling him back to those nights when ambition meant unity. He saw the crowd clapping, investors shaking hands, his name celebrated. Now the same name echoed as betrayal. David muttered, "I thought loyalty was our foundation, but loyalty was the first thing to burn." The glow of the morning sun painted his face, not as triumph, but as ash. David stood at the back door, staring into the garden where silence mocked him. Once he had celebrated victories here, laughing with Mark beneath glowing lanterns. Now, shadows held only betrayal. Emma joined him quietly. David said, "This was our sanctuary." His voice carried sorrow. Emma whispered, "You still have me." He closed his eyes, aching at the weight of those words. He said, "But he was my brother in everything but blood." Birds scattered from trees as though even nature refused his presence. David's fists trembled, the ache of loyalty betrayed gnawing deeper. Emma touched his arm, steady but fragile, her eyes wet with unspoken fear. He said, "I keep asking myself when he decided I wasn't worth saving." Silence stretched long, thick as chains, binding him to memories he could not escape. In the garden the grass was green, but for David, it looked burned with every footprint of their past. The phone rang again. Another unknown number. David ignored it, but the voicemail beep lingered. Emma urged, "You should listen." He shook his head, muttering, "More vultures." But then, a familiar voice emerged from the recording. An old friend said, "David, I don't know what to believe, but I hope you're okay." His chest tightened, eyes watering. David said, "Even my friends doubt me." Emma held his hand, saying, "They don't doubt you, they're afraid." He whispered, "Afraid of being near the fire." Silence filled the room, heavier than words. The voicemail replayed in his mind, the echo of fading friendships cutting sharper than headlines. He whispered again, "I am alone in this storm." Emma looked at him firmly. "No, you're not." But even her words struggled against the truth pressing down. Down. Afternoon, shadows stretched long as David sat at his desk, staring at framed certificates and awards. He whispered, "All of it means nothing now." Emma leaned against the doorway, watching him crumble under invisible weight. She said, "Those awards remind the world of who you really are." He shook his head slowly, saying, "No, they remind me of what I've lost." His voice cracked as memories pressed tighter. Once, he was a leader, a builder, a man admired. Now he was a headline, broken by betrayal. Emma stepped closer, her voice steady but gentle. "You can let this define you, or you can rise." David closed his eyes, whispering, "Rising feels impossible when the ground has been ripped away." The room fell silent, except for the ticking clock, each second louder than the last. The battle within him was no longer just survival, but the search for a reason to keep breathing. The silence broke when another sponsor sent an email cutting ties. David read it aloud, voice shaking. Effective immediately, our relationship ends. His chest collapsed inward as Emma whispered, "That was your last major contract." The weight crushed his shoulders. David muttered, "Years of building, undone by one betrayal." His phone lit again, another headline flashing accusations about shady dealings. David shouted, "Lies, all lies," but his voice bounced off empty walls. Emma placed her hand on his, steady but powerless. David looked at her. "Broken, they believe him, not me." Emma whispered, "Because Mark is feeding them exactly what they want." The truth wasn't enough to drown the noise. The room felt colder, as if every betrayal had left frost on the walls. His daughter peeked from behind the hallway, eyes wide with fear. David lowered his head, ashamed, whispering, "Even she sees me falling apart." That night, the news aired footage of Mark shaking hands with industry leaders, his voice praised as courageous. David gritted his teeth, saying, "He's wearing my crown." Emma said softly, "He's rewriting the story, David." The television glowed against his pale skin, projecting Mark's smirk like a knife. David clenched his fists, muttering, "Every success we shared, now claimed as his." Emma whispered, "He's turning survival into glory." David's throat tightened as the crowd on screen applauded Mark like a savior. He said, "Do they even remember I existed?" The betrayal tasted bitter, mixed with envy and despair. Emma reached for his shoulder, her voice steady. "They will remember when you show them the truth." But truth had no platform when Mark held the stage. David's eyes welled with tears, not of weakness but of anger boiling beneath loss. Morning headlines showed old photos of David, dredged from archives. His college mistakes, drunken nights, reckless words, all weaponized anew. David whispered, "They're digging up graves." Emma slammed the paper shut, furious. She said, "This isn't about truth, it's about destruction." David muttered. Mark handed them every bone. The weight of judgment pressed deeper. Friends who once toasted with him now cold in silence. Emma's voice shook. "Even my colleagues whisper about us." David gripped the table edge, veins tight, saying, "He's killing me slowly." Outside, reporters waited again, cameras hungry. Inside, David's past had been twisted into ammunition. He said, "I can't fight shadows from decades ago." Emma leaned close, whispering, "Then fight the man casting them." His silence was heavier than war drums, the betrayal now complete in its cruelty. As evening fell, David's phone rang with another betrayal. A business associate said, "We can't be linked with you anymore." His voice broke as he repeated the words to Emma. She said, "They are afraid, David, not loyal." He whispered, "They were family once." Memories of dinners, laughter, and toasts with colleagues now felt poison. David paced the room, muttering, "Fear makes cowards of everyone." Emma followed him, voice strong, "But fear doesn't erase who you are." He stopped, looking at her with hollow eyes, saying, "Maybe it already has." Outside, the mob's chants grew louder, blending with the echo of lost allies. Inside, his heart felt heavier than stone, trust buried beneath betrayal. The spiral tightened when David discovered leaked documents on social media. Sensitive files, once guarded, now spread like wildfire. His voice shook as he said, "This was Mark's final dagger." Emma gasped, her face pale. "He gave them everything." David's breathing turned ragged, rage boiling over. He shouted, "He destroyed not just me but everyone who trusted us." The internet erupted with analysts and critics dissecting every line of those documents. David slammed the desk, saying, "He left me nothing but ashes." Emma placed both hands on his shoulders, steadying him, whispering, "You still have me." His eyes burned as he whispered, "But for how long until he takes even that?" Betrayal had reached its cruelest peak, the spiral unstoppable, the storm endless. David sat in the dim study, head bowed over scattered papers, when Emma entered, holding a printed article. Her voice shook as she said, David, look at this. Mark's story doesn't add up. He lifted his eyes, dull with exhaustion, whispering, "What do you mean?" She laid the paper down. The headline accused Mark of leaking secrets months before the scandal broke. David's brow furrowed, voice rising, so he was plotting long before the storm hit. Emma said, "He used you as his shield while preparing his escape." David slammed his fist on the desk, muttering, "I defended him while he sharpened knives behind my back." The room felt smaller, but the air shifted, replaced by the first trace of clarity. Emma leaned close, voice low. "This isn't survival. This was betrayal with purpose." David's chest heaved as the weight of truth pressed harder, but it carried fire instead of despair. Emma flipped through documents she had gathered from old emails, her hands shaking. She said, "David, here. Mark signed contracts with rivals before the scandal." David's eyes widened, rage flaring. "He betrayed me not to survive, but to rise," he muttered. Emma said, "He wasn't saving himself, he was building his empire with your ashes." The truth poured like venom, filling the cracks of David's shattered trust. He leaned back, breath trembling, whispering, "All this time, I thought it was desperation." Emma's gaze was steady. "No, David. It was ambition, cold and planned." David's knuckles whitened as he clenched the papers, saying, "He turned me into the villain so he could be crowned the hero." The study grew heavier, but for the first time David's anger carried a spark of direction. David's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He hesitated, then opened it. Screenshots filled the screen, proof of Mark's dealings sent anonymously. David muttered, "Someone else knows the truth." Emma leaned in, whispering, "But why now?" The messages showed conversations of Mark promising secrets to competitors long before the scandal broke. David's voice hardened. "He sold me out piece by piece." Emma said, "Whoever sent this wanted you to see the full picture." David's hands trembled, both from rage and the flood of vindication. He said, "The mob condemned me without knowing he orchestrated everything." Emma placed her hand on his, steadying, "The truth isn't silent anymore, David. It's leaking through the cracks." His eyes, once hollow, burned with fragile resolve. David whispered, "If the world saw this, everything changes." Emma shook her head quickly. "Not everything. People want spectacle, not truth." He paced the room, phone in hand, voice sharp, "But this proves he planned it all." Emma said, "Evidence is not enough when his voice is louder." David's jaw tightened, muttering, "Then I'll make mine louder." The thought felt dangerous, yet empowering. Emma placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "If you fight this, you risk losing what little peace remains." David turned, eyes burning, "Peace is already gone." Silence stretched, broken only by the ticking clock, each second daring him forward. The revelation twisted deeper when Emma uncovered a folder hidden among old files. She gasped, "David, look! Financial statements in Mark's name, not yours." David flipped through the pages, his face hardening. He said, "He transferred everything under his control before the collapse." Emma whispered, "This was never a partnership. It was a takeover." David's chest burned as betrayal reached its sharpest edge. He muttered, "He built me up just to break me down." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "He stole your legacy before you even realized." David closed the folder with trembling hands, whispering, "Then this is no accident. This was his plan all along." The silence in the room was suffocating, but inside David, anger replaced despair, reshaping his broken heart into steel. David stood before the mirror, fists trembling, voice low but sharp. He said, "If I don't fight, he wins forever." Emma entered, her face pale, whispering, "David, this battle will consume you." His reflection looked back, hollow yet burning. David muttered, "The truth is all I have left." His phone vibrated with another headline praising Mark's courage. He shouted, "Courage? He's a thief wearing my skin." Emma's eyes welled with tears. "Please don't let hate destroy what's left of you." David's hands gripped the sink until knuckles whitened. He whispered, "I already lost everything. What more can hate take?" Silence hung heavy, broken only by dripping water. Emma said, It can still take you. His eyes rose to meet his reflection, no longer hollow but wild with resolve. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no turning back. The press conference hall buzzed with anticipation. David entered through the side door, cameras flashing like lightning. Emma walked behind him, silent support. David muttered under his breath, "They'll see my truth tonight." As microphones rose before him, he felt the weight of every betrayal. Reporters shouted, "David, did you steal company funds?" Another yelled, "Is Mark the real hero?" David raised his voice, shaking but fierce. "I was betrayed by the man you now call a savior." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Emma whispered from behind, "Hold your ground." David pounded the podium saying, "Mark sold every secret we built together." Reporters leaned in, hungry for spectacle. His chest heaved, rage and despair colliding. He shouted, "He destroyed everything, and you let him crown himself king." The room erupted in chaos, the climax unfolding before unblinking eyes. Mark appeared on a live broadcast across the hall, his face projected on screens behind the reporters. He smirked, saying, "David's anger proves his guilt." David's jaw clenched, eyes locked on the image. He shouted, "Your guilt hides in the files. Mark, the contracts, the secrets you leaked." Reporters turned screens toward him, tension escalating. Emma whispered, "He's trying to twist the fire back on you." David's hands shook, but his voice steadied. "Every lie you fed them was crafted to bury me while you built your throne." Mark's broadcasted face smiled wider, saying, "And still they believe me." David's voice broke into a roar, "Then let them see the truth with their own eyes." His phone, clutched tight, displayed the evidence sent anonymously. The room froze, the world holding its breath at the clash of betrayal and proof. David slammed the evidence on the podium, his voice shaking with rage. He said, "Here are Mark's contracts with rivals signed months before my fall." Gasps erupted from the room. Emma whispered, "They're listening, David." Mark's broadcast cut off suddenly, his smirk replaced by silence. David's voice grew stronger. "I was no villain. I was his victim." Reporters scrambled, cameras flashing, questions flying like arrows. David's chest heaved as he shouted, "You celebrated a liar while crucifying me." The hall roared with noise, some doubting, others whispering truth. Emma's hand gripped the podium, steadying him as he swayed from exhaustion. His eyes blazed with both fury and desperation. He whispered into the microphone, "This is the truth you buried under his lies." Silence fell, heavy and electrifying. The climax shattered into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, phones buzzed with breaking news, and David stood at the center, chest heaving. Emma whispered, "You've shown them, but the storm isn't over." David's voice cracked, "I've torn the mask off him." Cameras pushed closer, flashes relentless. He raised his head, whispering almost to himself, "Even if they never forgive me, they will know the truth." His face carried both triumph and ruin. Reporters screamed, "What happens now, David?" He closed his eyes, whispering, "Now the world decides." Emma's hand clasped his tightly, steadying him against the chaos. His voice grew faint but sharp, "This is my reckoning, not my surrender." The hall drowned in sound, but within him, silence felt heavier than thunder. The storm outside raged as David and Emma returned home, exhaustion heavy in their steps. David whispered, "They've seen the truth, but will they believe it?" Emma set her coat aside, saying, "Belief takes time, but seeds are planted." David sat heavily on the sofa, head in hands, muttering, "I fear the damage is beyond repair." Emma knelt beside him, her eyes soft but steady. "You stood your ground when it mattered most." David looked at her, voice breaking, "But at what cost? My name is Ash. My daughter sees me as broken." Emma held his trembling hands, whispering, "She also sees a father who fought." His heart cracked at her words. Outside, thunder echoed, but inside the room was thick with silence. For the first time, David's despair carried a thread of fragile dignity. The next morning, David stepped onto the porch. Reporters were fewer, their voices softer. A neighbor across the street glanced at him, then quickly looked away. David whispered, "Silence is colder than hatred." Emma joined him, her voice calm. "Silence can also mean doubt, David. Maybe they're questioning what they have been told." He sighed, staring at the fading crowd, muttering, "Or maybe they just want to move on without me." Emma placed her hand on his arm, saying, "You cannot control their whispers, only your steps forward." David's shoulders slumped, but his gaze lifted slightly, the first hint of resolve pushing against the weight. The storm within had not ended, but the air outside felt different, less venom, more uncertainty. David sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence again, his fingers brushing over documents that now felt like weapons. Emma leaned against the doorway, saying, "You don't have to keep reliving it." He replied, "Every page is proof, and proof is all I have left." His voice cracked, heavy with both anger and weariness. Emma said softly, "You are more than the papers, David. You are more than what Mark took from you." He closed the folder, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, whispering, "But these are the only things that still speak for me." Emma stepped forward, placing her hand on the folder, whispering, "No, David, you still speak for yourself." His eyes lifted, damp with pain but touched with the spark of fragile belief. The news began shifting slowly. Some reporters questioned Mark's narrative, small cracks forming in his image. David scrolled through articles, his lips trembling. He whispered, "They're beginning to see him for what he is." Emma leaned over his shoulder, her voice steady. "The truth has claws, David. It always finds a way out." He exhaled sharply, saying, "But it's too late for me. My name will never be clean." Emma touched his cheek, her voice soft but fierce, maybe not spotless, but strong. Stronger than before. David's eyes welled as he whispered, "Strong feels like a word for survivors, not ruins." Emma said firmly, "You are both." Her words hung in the air, heavy yet healing, like a lifeline tossed into a storm. Night fell quiet, the storm outside replaced by calm drizzle. David stood in the backyard, looking up at the sky. Emma joined him, wrapping her arm through his. David whispered, "Maybe this is the start of something new, even if it's not redemption." Emma said gently, "You don't need redemption, David. You need peace." He nodded slowly, his voice fragile but sincere. "Peace sounds like the hardest battle yet." She leaned against him, whispering, "It's the one worth fighting." His gaze lingered on the horizon, the rain soft on his face, mixing with tears that finally felt cleansing instead of suffocating. For the first time since Betrayal, the silence felt like release instead of a prison. The morning after the press conference, David sat at the kitchen table, silent, staring at headlines spreading across the screen. Some defended him, others still cursed his name. Emma poured coffee, whispering, "The world is divided now." David muttered, "It always was, Emma. They only chose which story to believe." He scrolled further, seeing reporters question Mark's credibility for the first time. David's lips trembled, whispering, "Finally, cracks in his mask." Emma touched his shoulder, saying, "Truth cuts slower but deeper." His eyes carried both relief and sorrow. He whispered, "Even if I win, I've already lost the man I once was." Silence settled heavy, the sound of the clock marking time like a funeral bell. David stood outside the courthouse where Mark was being questioned by investigators. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions. David whispered to Emma, "I never thought I'd see him cornered." Emma said firmly, "He's facing the world he created." Across the steps, Mark appeared, expression pale, but still defiant. Reporters pressed forward, flashes relentless. David's chest rose sharply as he muttered, "He looks smaller now." Emma replied softly, "Because lies shrink when the truth breathes." David's hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of vindication finally near. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. He whispered, "Maybe this isn't my end after all." That evening, David watched television coverage of Mark's faltering interview. That win. The once confident betrayer now dodged questions. David whispered, "He's unraveling." Emma leaned forward on the sofa, saying, The mask never lasts forever. For the first time in months, David's lips curved into the faintest smile, but it carried no joy. He muttered, "His downfall won't rebuild me." Emma replied, "No, but it frees you." David leaned back, whispering, "Freedom feels strange when you've lived in chains." The news anchor reported, "Evidence shows inconsistencies in Mark's claims." David's chest tightened, whispering, "Justice whispers quietly, but I hear it." The television glow flickered across his face, capturing both relief and sorrow. Later that night, David stepped outside into the drizzle, breathing deeply. He whispered to Emma, "The air feels lighter." She stood beside him, replying, "Because the truth is no longer locked away." David looked at the wet street, reflecting street lamps, saying, "People may never fully forgive me." Emma held his hand, whispering, "Forgiveness isn't the goal. Survival is." He closed his eyes, rain on his face, whispering, "Survival feels like victory enough." Silence surrounded them, heavy yet cleansing. The storm that once consumed him had passed, leaving scars but also space to breathe. The final dawn arrived quietly. David stood before the mirror, no longer seeing the shattered man of weeks past. His reflection still carried scars, but his eyes were steadier. Emma entered, saying softly, "You don't look broken anymore." David whispered, "I'm not whole, but I'm alive." He turned to her, voice trembling. "He took everything, but he didn't take this breath." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes moist, whispering, "And that breath is enough to begin again." David's gaze returned to his reflection, whispering the final blow. "Mark destroyed my empire, but not my soul." The words lingered in the silence, sharp as a blade, echoing in the air long after they were spoken.